The Most Disturbing Cults in History, Part 4. Paul Schaefer was a Santa-slaying, one-eyed pedophile, torture-inducing cult leader who set up an imprisoned cult community in Chile. Following the end of World War II, many Nazi and Nazi sympathizers fled to South America to avoid persecution. But Schaefer didn't just flee Germany because of that. He was also under investigation for multiple counts of sexual abuse against children while he was operating an orphanage. He came in contact with the Chilean ambassador who invited him to South America. In 1961, he purchased a 4,400-acre ranch which him and his 10 followers stayed at. By 1963, another 230 followers migrated to the compound. Between 1966 and 1973, another 15 families joined them. Paul led his followers in the teachings of William Branham, who was also an influence on Jim Jones. Paul Schaefer, who was also a minister, claimed that during a meeting with Branham, he experienced a healing. Following that meeting, he began to strongly preach that all sin and illness was the result of demonic possession. Behind armed guards, attack dogs, and barbed wire fences is what he called Dignity Colony. Over the some 46 years that the colony existed, it became so large that it produced its own cheese, bread, and sausages. It even had its own state-of-the-art hospital, school, TV station, power plant, and even an airstrip. The cult members worked the land, with the opposite sex being forbidden to speak to one another. Children were separated from their parents and placed in their own gender-specific dormitories. Aside from being just a one-eyed Nazi pedophile, he was also known as the murderer of Santa Claus. A story spread that one December, all the children were excited about the arrival of Santa Claus. Schaefer had one of his followers dress up as Saint Nick and he pretended to shoot him in front of the children. Beatings within the colony were a regular occurrence to those who broke the rules. When dictator Augusto Pinochet came into power in 1973, naturally him and Paul became good friends. He allowed Schaefer to import and export without paying taxes and allowed the cult to continue operation without bother from the authorities. In return, Schaefer and his men would help train Pinochet's men in the art of torture. Because there was more to the colony than just what was on the surface. Underground was a series of complex bunkers and tunnels which were used for torture. Electrocution and psychotropic drugging were very commonplace for those who went against the colony or enemies of the state. One man, Wolfgang Mueller, managed to escape the colony a total of 3 times. The first 2 times he was found in a nearby town, brought back, beaten, and drugged. The 3rd time he managed to get to the German embassy, but he wasn't safe yet. Schaefer actually sent 15 armed men to the embassy to collect him. Thankfully, he was unsuccessful and Wolfgang managed to make it back to Germany. Schaefer insisted on being called the permanent uncle and would have his closest lieutenants deliver boys right to his room. Children and parents were taught that it was an honor to have them chosen to go into the bed of their supreme leader. Following the end of Pinochet's government, as well as testimonies of victims who had escaped the colony, an arrest warrant was put out on Schaefer. He staged a final farewell ceremony declaring his innocence before disappearing into the tunnels below. He was discovered 8 years later living in a nice gated community just outside of Buenos Aires, Argentina. During a search of his colony, the investigators found a military-scale stash of weapons. More than 100 assault rifles, 90 submachine guns, dozens and dozens of hand grenades, and even some surface-to-air missiles. In 2018, a mass grave was being excavated on the property to try to find those people who had disappeared over the years. They believe at least 300 some people were interrogated and tortured on the property. Now, you would think someone as evil and twisted as Paul Schaefer would easily get the death penalty, but this wasn't the case. In 2006, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the abuse of 25 children, 5 counts of child rape, and had to pay $1.4 million to 11 victims. He died at the age of 88 from heart failure in the penitentiary hospital. The Most Disturbing Cults in History, Part 5. Australia's most notorious cult ran in secrecy by a yoga teacher who believed she was the reincarnation of Jesus, fed LSD to children, and wanted to create the master race. Buckle up because this one is quite the story. Born in 1921, Anne HamiltonBurn grew up outside of Melbourne, Australia. When she was young, her mother died in a mental hospital and her father wasn't too keen on being a single parent, so she bounced around to different orphanages. Later in life, she had a child and lost her husband in a tragic car accident. That is when she took up yoga and began teaching it in the city. In the 60s is when mysticism and Eastern religion began to make their way west, and a lot of people were very interested in it. During one of her yoga lessons, she met physicist Dr. Raynor Johnson. He referred to Anne as the wisest, serenest, most gentle, gracious soul he had ever met. Together, they began using LSD and started to recruit members into the cult, which was known as the Family. They used Johnson's property right outside of the city of Melbourne as their headquarters, where they held weekly meetings. They spread a mishmash of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity. Another large outlet for new recruits was the New Haven Hospital, which was mostly ran by members of the Family. Many of the patients at the New Haven Hospital they treated with LSD. She easily became a multi-millionaire funded by the cult members. She got everything she wanted from the cult members: homes, cars, money, and eventually even children. When the 1970s rolled around, 28 children became members of the Family. Some were offsprings of members, others were falsely adopted, and some even stolen. With such powerful people working for the Family, such as doctors and attorneys, anything was possible for them to acquire. All of the children were told that Anne was their biological mother. Their identities were completely changed and they were given fake birth certificates. She dyed all of their hair blonde, changed all of their last names to HamiltonBurn, all to convince them that they were related. She kept the charade going by wearing homemade smocks to fake her pregnancies, and told the members of the Family that they would survive the end of the world and become the new master race. Anne, along with her husband Bill, were the unquestioned leaders of the cult. Beatings were commonplace to children who stepped out of line, and they were given daily doses of Valium to keep them docile. This continued on until they reached the age of 14. That is when a bizarre initiation ritual was done. They would be given an insanely large dose of LSD and locked in a room alone. They would only be seldomly visited by Anne or one of the cult psychiatrists. As you can imagine, this had long-lasting impacts on all the children and cult members. When screaming would be heard by neighbors and police were summoned to the property, the children were instructed to hide and cram into this tiny hole. Her only role was do everything she says. The Family's motto was unseen, unknown, unheard, and they had little contact to the outside world. It wasn't until 1987 when a 14-year-old girl named Sarah Moore was expelled from the group for not behaving and went right to police. Police raided their headquarters on August 14th, and all the children were placed in protective custody. As for Anne and Bill, they fled the country. For 4.5 years, they hid in upstate New York before finally being extradited back to Australia. Despite a massive investigation, raids on the property, they spent little to no time in jail. In the end, they only had to pay 3 $5,000 fines for falsifying 3 of the birth certificates. Like, that is it. After destroying so many lives, that is it. Unfortunately, on this one, no justice was served, and Anne spent her last years suffering from dementia in a Melbourne nursing home. She died at the age of 98 in 2019. The Most Disturbing Cults in History, Part 6. Black magic rituals, human sacrifice, and well over a dozen victims. This is the disturbing true story of Mexico's brutal narco-Satanist cult. Adolfo Constanzo was the leader of the cult and referred to as the Godfather. He commanded his followers alongside the godmother Sarah Aldrete. Adolfo was born in Miami, Florida, and exposed to many different kinds of religion growing up, such as Voodoo, Santeria, and Palo Mayombe. Neighbors of the Constanzos would complain that after a confrontation with the family, dead animals would be left at their doorsteps. His mother at one point was even arrested for harboring 27 small animals in their apartment. It was reported that when the animals were removed, the walls were smeared with blood and feces. They would use the animals as sacrifices during their rituals. Animal bones and other items would be placed into an iron cauldron, which was known as an aganga. His mother always believed that he had special powers, and he always believed that he was psychic. He would often brag, saying that he foresaw the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. In his 20s, he became a Palo Mayombe priest and relocated down to Mexico. He was charging upwards of $2,000 for ritual cleansings and fortune telling. Doctors, lawyers, movie stars, high-ranking politicians would all pay top dollar for his services. He also helped out drug traffickers using his magical visions to show when they should make shipments. With promises of magical protection against bullets and police, he was quick to recruit new members into the cult. With many of his clients being rich drug traffickers and hitmen, they actually enjoyed the violence of the animal sacrifices for the rituals. Through friends and relatives, straight-A college student Sarah would eventually become the cult's godmother. She lived south of the border but attended high school and college in Brownsville, Texas. When Adolfo wasn't robbing graves for another ritual, he was heavily involved with the Hernandez brothers drug cartel. He quickly rose to the top of the ranks. The narco-Satanists eventually set up shop at a ranch less than a mile from the US border. The property, which was owned by the Hernandez brothers, became known as the Devil's Ranch. That was their base of operations for torture, rituals, and drug dealing. The cult's first victims were rival gang members, other gang members, or corrupt cops who had been kidnapped. They would be horrifically tied up, tortured, and ritualistically slain. Various body parts would then be put into the iron cauldron, made into a disgusting brew, and drank. They believed that this brew made them invisible and bulletproof. Some members even wore necklaces made from their victim's spine. To achieve ultimate power, Costanzo decided he needed the brain of an American student. That is when pre-med student Mark Kilroy would disappear during spring break of 1989. Him and some friends left their car on the US side of the border and walked across the bridge. When they were finished having their fun, everyone would walk back to the car, but Mark never showed up. He was kidnapped by the cult and taken back to the ranch where he was brutally tortured. They then used his brain and spine for a ritual before dismembering him and burying him on the property. But this would also mark the beginning of the end for the cult, as Mark's family was powerful and wealthy. Mark's uncle was a special agent with the U.S. Customs Service, and he raised alarms all throughout law enforcement in the U.S. and Mexico. Now, there was little to no evidence as to where Mark could have went. Thankfully, a cartel member managed to show police right where to go. That cartel member blew right through a police drug checkpoint thinking he was invisible. He led police right to the ranch and even admitted that they had something to do with the disappearance of Mark Kilroy. Law enforcement searched the property 8 days later and made some horrific discoveries. Firstly, they found Adolfo's cauldron, which was still stuffed with bones. They also discovered his kill shack, which had body parts, torture devices, and tons of blood. Buried on the property, they found 27 mutilated bodies, one of which was Mark Kilroy's. Once all evidence was removed, police burned down the ranch and placed a memorial cross there. When Adolfo realized that the police had found the bodies on the property, him and some of his followers fled to an apartment in Mexico City. Police tracked him down and a shootout began. Some of his followers were killed in the shootout and he took his own life. As for Sarah the godmother, she was caught trying to flee the building. To this day, she maintains her total innocence, even though she was on the run with him. She said she didn't know anything about human sacrifice and that police beat her into a confession. During her first trial, she received 6 years in prison for criminal association. But during a second trial, she was convicted of several of the killings at the cult's headquarters and sentenced to 30 years. If she ever is released, American authorities plan to prosecute her for the death of Mark Kilroy.